Some moments in life are so fragile, so sacred, that they feel like they might shatter if you breathe too hard. Simon Cowell had judged thousands of performances, witnessed countless emotional moments, but nothing could have prepared him for what happened on that Tuesday evening in London. Because sometimes, a stage isn't about entertainment. Sometimes it's about saying goodbye. Her name was Catherine Miller, and she was 41 years old. She walked onto the Got Talent stage slowly, carefully, as if each step required concentration. She wore a simple navy blue dress and a colorful silk scarf wrapped around her head. No hair showed beneath it. Her skin was pale, almost translucent under the stage lights, and there was a fragility to her movements that made the audience unconsciously hold their breath. But her eyes were bright, determined, burning with a purpose that transcended her physical frailty. Simon sat at the judges' table, his usual critical expression softening immediately. He'd seen enough of life to recognize what he was looking at. This woman was sick, very sick, and she was here anyway. The host approached with a gentle smile, his usual enthusiasm tempered by obvious concern. "Welcome to Britain's Got Talent. Please tell us your name." "Catherine Miller." Her voice was soft but steady. "I'm from Manchester." "And what brings you here today, Catherine?" Catherine's hand moved to touch the scarf on her head, a self-conscious gesture that spoke volumes. When she spoke, her voice remained calm, but there was an undercurrent of emotion barely held in check. "I have stage 4 pancreatic cancer," she said simply. The audience gasped softly. "I was diagnosed 8 months ago. The doctors gave me 6 months to live. That was 2 months ago." The silence in the theater was profound. Simon's arms, which had been crossed, slowly lowered to the table. His expression shifted from professional interest to something deeper. Recognition of mortality. Respect for courage. "I have a daughter," Catherine continued. "Her name is Sophie. She's 17, and she's sitting right there." Catherine pointed toward the front row of the audience. The cameras swung to capture a teenage girl with long brown hair, tears already streaming down her face. She looked exactly like her mother must have looked at that age. The resemblance was heartbreaking. "Sophie doesn't know I'm here today," Catherine said. "She thinks I'm at a doctor's appointment. But I needed to do this. I needed to give her something that would last after I'm gone." One of the judges, a woman, brought her hand to her mouth, tears visible in her eyes. The audience sat in stunned silence. This wasn't a typical audition. This was something else entirely. "What will you be performing for us today?" the host asked gently. "I'm going to sing the lullaby I sang to Sophie every night when she was a baby. The same one my mother sang to me. I want her to have a recording of it, so that when I'm gone, she can still hear me singing to her." The host's eyes were wet. He nodded, unable to speak for a moment, then stepped back. Simon leaned forward, his elbows on the table. He looked at Catherine with an intensity that was different from his usual judging gaze. This wasn't about talent. This was about witnessing something sacred. A mother's final gift. "Catherine," Simon said, his voice unusually quiet. "Take all the time you need." Catherine nodded, gripping the microphone with both hands. Her hands trembled slightly. Whether from illness or emotion, no one could tell. She closed her eyes and took a breath, and then she began to sing. Her voice was thin, weakened by illness and treatment, but it carried something that no amount of vocal training could provide. It carried a mother's love, pure, unconditional, eternal. She sang a simple melody, words about safety and love and promises to always watch over those we love. In the front row, Sophie was crying openly, her hands covering her face. Around her, audience members were pulling out tissues. On stage, Catherine sang with her eyes closed, as if she was back in a darkened nursery 17 years ago, holding her baby daughter. The judges sat motionless. The woman judge had tears streaming down her face. Another judge was staring down at the table, his jaw clenched. And Simon Cowell, who had built a career on being unmovable, sat with his hand pressed against his mouth, his eyes fixed on Catherine with an expression of profound respect. Catherine reached the chorus, her voice gaining strength from somewhere deep inside. She sang about how love doesn't end, how a mother's presence remains even when she's gone, how every star in the sky carries the love of those who came before. Then, halfway through the second verse, Catherine stopped singing. The backing track continued for a few notes before the sound engineer, realizing something was happening, cut it off. Catherine opened her eyes and looked directly at her daughter in the audience. "Sophie, baby," she said, her voice breaking. "I need you to hear this." Sophie stood up, trembling, tears flowing freely. The cameras captured everything. Mother and daughter, separated by 30 feet and an impossible goodbye. "I know you're scared," Catherine said. "I know you don't want me to leave. And sweetheart, I don't want to go. But I need you to understand something. Death isn't the end of love. It's not even the end of me being your mother." Simon stood up. Not dramatically, not for show. He stood up and walked around the judges' table with quiet purpose. The other judges watched him, the audience watched him, but Catherine and Sophie only saw each other. Simon walked onto the stage and stopped beside Catherine. He reached out and gently lowered the microphone she was holding, then turned to the sound booth. "Cut all microphones," he said quietly. "All of them." The technical staff hesitated, confused. Simon repeated himself more firmly. "Cut them, now. This moment doesn't belong to us." The microphones clicked off. The massive theater fell into complete, profound silence. 2,000 people barely breathing. Simon gestured to Sophie. "Come here," he said softly. Sophie hesitated, then climbed onto the stage. She ran to her mother and collapsed into her arms. Catherine held her daughter, one hand cradling her head, and began to whisper words that no microphone captured, that no camera could translate. Private words, sacred words, a mother's final wisdom given to her daughter. Simon stepped back, giving them space. He turned to the audience and placed a finger to his lips, asking for silence. No one moved. No one made a sound. They were witnessing something that transcended entertainment, that transcended television itself. Catherine and Sophie held each other for what felt like an eternity and a heartbeat all at once. When they finally separated, both their faces were wet with tears, but Sophie was nodding, understanding something that would take years to fully comprehend. Simon approached them again. He looked at Catherine with an expression that few people had ever seen on his face: humility, reverence. "Catherine," he said, his voice rough, "I've been doing this for 20 years. I've heard every kind of voice, every kind of story. But what you just did, giving your daughter that gift, that moment, that's the bravest thing I've ever witnessed." He turned to the other judges. "We don't need to deliberate on this." He walked to the golden buzzer and placed his hand on it. But before pressing it, he turned back to Catherine. "This isn't about judging your performance. This is about honoring your courage and making sure that what you came here to do, creating a memory for your daughter, is remembered by everyone." He pressed the golden buzzer. Golden confetti fell from the ceiling. The music played. The lights turned gold. But none of it felt celebratory. It felt like a tribute, a standing ovation for life itself. The audience rose to their feet, but the applause was different. It wasn't the usual cheering and shouting. It was respectful, almost reverent. People were applauding through tears, honoring not a performance, but a mother's love. Catherine held Sophie close as the golden confetti fell around them. Simon stood nearby, and for the first time in his career, he was crying openly on camera. Not trying to hide it, not ashamed of it, simply human in the face of something greater than himself. After the cameras stopped rolling, Simon didn't leave. He stayed with Catherine and Sophie for over an hour. He made calls to his contacts, arranging for the audio and video from the audition to be professionally produced and given to Sophie in every format imaginable. He ensured that the recording would be protected, preserved, eternal. He also, though he never spoke about it publicly, made arrangements to cover all of Catherine's medical expenses and to establish a trust fund for Sophie's education. When Catherine tried to thank him, he simply shook his head. "You gave the world something today," he said. "This is the least I can do." Catherine Miller passed away 6 weeks after her audition. She was surrounded by family, including Sophie, who held her hand and sang the lullaby back to her as she took her final breaths. The episode aired 2 weeks after Catherine's death, with Sophie's permission. It became the most watched Got Talent moment in history, not because it was entertaining, but because it was real. It was a reminder that love survives everything, that a mother's voice can echo across the boundary between life and death, that sometimes television can capture lightning in a bottle and create something eternal. Sophie attended the live shows in her mother's honor. She sat in the front row every week, and before each show started, the audience would stand and applaud her. Not with pity, but with respect for someone carrying her mother's love forward. Years later, Sophie would describe that moment on stage as the greatest gift her mother ever gave her. Not the recording, though she listened to it almost every night, but the public declaration that their love was stronger than death, that her mother chose to spend some of her final precious moments ensuring Sophie knew she would never, ever be alone. Simon Cowell never spoke extensively about that night in interviews, but those who worked with him noticed a change afterward. He was still critical, still honest, but there was a depth to his compassion that hadn't been there before, as if Catherine had reminded him of what really matters. Because that night, Catherine Miller didn't just sing a lullaby. She proved that a mother's love is the one force in the universe that death cannot touch. And Simon Cowell, along with 2,000 witnesses and millions of viewers, learned that sometimes the most powerful performances have nothing to do with talent, and everything to do with the courage it takes to love someone so completely that you'll spend your final moments ensuring they know it. That's not television. That's the human experience in its purest form. And sometimes, just sometimes, those two things become the same.